Thank you so much, Eileen, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. We are looking forward to having some good discussion around today's topic, which is climate change and food security. Okay. Can everyone see my slides? Okay. So just a quick once-over for any new people to the group. This series of webinars is part of the Joining Hands Food and Land Tables. So Joining Hands is an initiative of the Presbyterian Hunger Program. The program works to mobilize people in focused campaigns to tackle systemic causes of hunger both in the United States and abroad. The program has 3 campaign focuses: food, land, and water, resource extraction and climate change, and trade justice. So again, today's focus is going to be around climate change and its impact on food security. So at the end of our last webinar, I left you with a couple of articles around climate change and to touch base on to prepare for this discussion. But I just wanted to pull up a couple of slides that really sort of begin a conversation. So climate change will affect all 4 dimensions of food security: food availability, food accessibility, the way we use food, as well as food systems stability. It'll have an impact on human health, livelihood, assets, and it's a serious problem, as we've been hearing about, and we'll continue to hear more about it. So to get right to it, we have 2 presenters for you today. Our first presenter is Liddy Nakpil, and Liddy is the convener of the Philippines Movement for Climate Justice, director of Jubilee South, and a member of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. So with that, I would like us to turn the conversation over to Liddy. She'll be telling us a bit about the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice.
Hello, good evening. Hello, good evening. Can you all hear me? I'm very happy to join you and explain a little bit in terms of our own experiences, as well as the work we have done studying the impacts of climate change on food, on land, and on water. The slide you are looking at on screen is a picture, a photo of a place in the Philippines taken very recently. We're now undergoing the worst El Nino episode in history. El Nino is a weather event that brings drought to many places. There's lack of rain, and it has affected our people so significantly that there's a lot of hunger in many places and a lot of unrest. You've probably heard that in just a couple of 3 weeks ago, there was demonstrations of farmers who were demanding assistance by the government in terms of rice subsidies and support. And after 3 days of a standoff in a major street in the city in the south of the Philippines, there was an open fire against the farmers, and a few people died and several were injured. More than 100 were injured. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which is an organization of more than 2,000 scientists and decision makers, confirms that climate change is quickly becoming one of the root causes of hunger and poverty. We don't need the IPCC report actually to confirm that with us, because in the Philippines, this is one of the clearest impact of climate change on Filipinos, the impact on food. Climate change means many things. Destabilization of rainfall patterns. Our farmers are telling us it's very difficult to say when the rains come, how strong they will be. They come and then they stop and then they come again. There is, in many places of the world, impacted by the decreasing size of glaciers because they affect freshwater resources, which is very important for food. There is higher temperatures, droughts and desertification, extreme weather events such as what we experience in the Philippines, super typhoons and super El Niños, which we are very vulnerable to. There is sea level rise, and these are some of the more immediate impacts or implications of climate change. What that means for food production are the following. There has been recorded reduction in crop yields, particularly in staple crops. This is due to, for instance, the heat stress. Many crops are very vulnerable to heat, the lack of water, the erratic seasons. There is destruction of crops and devastation of agricultural land, which takes years to recover. Those particularly affected are areas where they plant, harvest from coconuts, and coconut trees take at least 10 years to grow. So Typhoon Yolanda, or Typhoon Haiyan as it is internationally known, has affected thousands of hectares of land which are planted with coconuts, and so this will take at least 10 years to recover. There is incursion of seawater, which means increase in soil salinity and decrease in land areas for crops. There are changes in the behavior and the spread of pests and diseases which further threaten crops. A warmer, more humid atmosphere also increases the impacts of ground level ozone, which reduces the rate of photosynthesis in plants, hampering growth and making crops more vulnerable to drought. There is increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is actually what is causing global warming, and these have been shown to reduce the protein levels in some crops, including wheat, rice, barley, and potatoes, which are staples for tens of millions of people. 70% of crops used directly for human food consumption rely on insects for pollination, but bees and other pollinators are vulnerable to changes such as climate extremes, which upset the timing of insect emergence and plant flowering. The combined impacts of changing temperatures, rainfall, and humidity can ultimately lead to the loss of key natural systems, which is very vital for our food systems. Climate change also means warming of the oceans and ocean acidification, as methane gas is produced when oceans warm. And this has tremendous impacts on fishing. Fish is the main source of protein for tens of millions of people, including Filipinos. And there has already been recorded reduction of fish stock and sizes of fish as a result of ocean warming. Extreme weather events disrupt livelihoods and food distribution systems, leaving communities dislocated and stranded without food or water. And with this we have seen, as we have been hit by super typhoon one after the other in the last few years. The decrease in food supply also lead to significant increases in food prices. The poorest farmers will suffer the worst effects, the women among them even more so, with less infrastructure and economic resources to adapt to change and recover from damages. In both urban and rural areas, wage labor dependent households will be particularly affected by food price increases. Present impacts are already very significant, even devastating for the most vulnerable communities. And this is only from a 0.86 degrees Celsius increase in average global temperatures. Our ability to produce food in the future will even be more threatened as climate change worsens. Targets contained in the Paris Agreement that was adopted last December will at best still lead to a 3-degree temperature increase. So we are very much aware that there's a lot of things that we need to do in order to stop catastrophic climate change. And one of the things that will compel people to act is for us to show the very significant impacts it will have on food security. Thank you.
Thank you, Liddy. So with that, we want to hold all of our questions until the end, and this way we can get a good dialogue going with both Liddy and with our next presenter, the Reverend Peggy Clark. Reverend Peggy Clark is a Unitarian Universalist minister currently serving the First Unitarian Society of Westchester in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. She's also the Racial and Social Justice Consultant for the New York Metro District and chair of the National Unitarian Universalist Climate Justice Initiative, Commit to Respond. Reverend Clark sits on the steering committee for the UU Environmental Justice Collaboratory and chairs the UU Food Justice Ministry. And so with that, I'd like to turn things over to Reverend Peggy Clark. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to probably repeat some of what we just heard, although I do want to just clarify one thing. The Paris Agreement, I was an observer delegate to COP21 for my denomination. The Paris Agreement actually targeted no more than 2 degrees increase and a goal of a 1.5 degree increase. We hit 1 degree while we were in Paris in December. So we're actually dangerously close, and there's enough carbon in the atmosphere to bring us to 3 degrees. But that's what the agreement is for, is to try and reduce those things. So let's just look at some of the issues. I hope I'm not doing too much repeating, but I think I have some new information in here. So the land use is a major cause of climate change. Really, this is a lot about clearing land. So we've been clearing land for farmland. We're affecting 2 things. One of them is we're getting rid of the trees that are acting as filters for us. You know, they are desperately needed. As we increase carbon, we actually should be increasing, not decreasing trees. It's also that as we clear, we are affecting the way that sunlight reflects from the ground, which is about a 20%. So about 20% of our land use is climate change. So placement on the food chain is a huge issue. How is it that we're eating? When we are eating lower on the food chain, we are reducing our own impact. Livestock is 70% of agricultural land. 30% of all the land on the planet is used for agriculture. 70% of that is for livestock. Livestock produce greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. The United Nations estimates that 18% of greenhouse gases are from livestock. This is also an issue around how we're feeding animals. So if we are producing, for instance, 1 kilogram of beef, for each kilogram, we need 5 to 7 kilograms of grain. So it is costing us, the lower that we eat on the food chain, where we're eating the grain, for instance, rather than the beef, we would be, as one of our key ways of reducing impact. Production is a major issue. So our growing practices, fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers trap carbon in the soil. organic, I'm sorry, I've got too many things on my mind right now. Organic fertilizers trap carbon in the soil. Synthetic fertilizers are often made from fossil fuels. They are manufactured and transported from great distances because they're not produced in that many places. And they produce nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in trapping heat. Storing food, packaging food also have implications. Transporting food has serious implications, although it has fewer implications, and I say this as a locavore, it has fewer implications than we think that it does. A study was done, for instance, in New Zealand on lamb being shipped thousands of miles to the UK, and they discovered that that lamb actually produced 20% of the greenhouse gases that lamb produced in the UK and eaten in the UK produced, and that was because the lamb in New Zealand is fed grass, and in the UK it's fed grain. So the transportation didn't actually tip the scale in any way. It was really how those animals are being raised that makes the big difference. We've heard a lot about food security. This is the definition of food security. According to the World Food Summit, which was updated fairly recently, food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So we've now heard a lot about that, but really we need to think about every part of the system and how it works, how climate affects how much food is available, at what cost, and as we have an increase in climate change, we will have an increase of cost. We will also have an increase of people who are hungry. The United Nations estimates that at another 175 million people who will be hungry in the next decade. Food security is affected by everything. It's how we produce, process, package, sell, consume, dispose. It's about transportation. It's about trade. All of these things are affected, and we just heard a great presentation on that. So how do we reduce our impact? By eating less meat, and not just less meat, by eating fewer foods that are produced by animals. Buying organic or natural here in this country to become certified organic is actually a very expensive proposition, and small independent farmers have trouble being certified. But if you're working with your own local farmers and they are natural farmers, that's absolutely good enough. They don't have to be certified organic, and often can't be certified organic because it's cost prohibitive. Eating locally does make a difference. It's less of a difference than we want it to be, although it does also address a variety of other issues. For instance, supporting local farmers does mean that you can be in relationship with them, you can watch things like labor practices, treatment of animals, and it's also about growing communities. One way to really reduce impact is to grow some of your own food, which I know sounds really prohibitive. It sounds like whoever has the time for that. But it makes a huge difference in our ability in terms of food security in any way that we're able to grow any of our own food. And reduction of food waste would make a big difference also. We throw out, in this country, we throw out a tremendous amount of food. And of course the production for all of that food, we then are requiring more production for more food. So one of the things that I've done is I've been starting local food options for people. So at Intergenerate, we start community gardens, and we start teaching gardens, and we have a chicken co-op. So that's 45 chickens being raised by 25 families. It's a way for people to grow their own food, reduce their impact, be careful about organic and natural practices, but it's also a really important way of building community. And as we're looking at a world that's increasingly fragmented, and we're looking at the increase of fossil fuels burning and the consequences of that, and the requirement to start thinking in a more hyper-local way, building stronger communities and building a stronger planet together make a lot of sense. So these ways of gardening together, growing food together, raising animals together in community is a viable option really for anybody, whether you're in cities or the suburbs or you're living rurally. So I'm sure that there are a lot of questions, and I went through a lot of material too quickly, but thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Peggy. With that, we did go through a lot of material from both Peggy and Liddy, and I did have some questions for both of you around the kind of organizing work that you're doing around climate change. For Liddy, I'd love for you to share a bit with us about the kind of organizing that the global campaign to demand climate justice is doing and what that work looks like. And then Peggy, I'd like to also hear from you more about what the work looks like here in the U.S. So, Liddy?
Yes. Well, 2 years ago, we decided in the global campaign to demand climate justice to launch a global campaign on food, land, water, and climate change, because this is really one area where the impacts of climate change is felt most by people. And as also Peggy explained, our food production systems is also one of the major causes of climate change. So it's very important for people to be able to connect the issue of climate change in struggling with and addressing the various food issues that many movements in the South have been actually addressing for the last many years. So this campaign involves several countries. It's in its early stages. We have movements in Asia where we first started the discussions around the campaign and building consensus around the campaign. We have fisher folk, farmers movements, women's movements, and workers, labor movements in a meeting last year, in an assembly last year, where we adopted and decided that we will be campaigning together on this. It involves the following countries in Asia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal. Nepal in particular is in a very vulnerable situation because of the earthquake that hit them last year. And we are also reaching out to more Asian countries. We have also been collaborating with and in discussions with Southern Rural Movement in Southern Africa Rural Movement in Africa, particularly with our colleagues in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, and in other places where they have already started reaching out, to include also East Africa, our groups in Kenya, for instance. We have also started discussing this with our colleagues in El Salvador, in Mesoamerica, actually in several countries in Mesoamerica, because part of the global campaign includes the Mesoamerican Campaign for Climate Justice. So there are several demands that we are forwarding to our governments in order to address the issue of impacts of climate change on food. And one of those demands include questions about or demands around the issue of land conversion. We believe that it's really even more important now to secure land for the production of food staples, so that one of the issues that we are trying to raise globally is the need to stop the conversion to non-food uses. So that's one of the things that we will be working on in the next few weeks, because we also want to raise this within the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change sessions, and the Conference of Parties as a global concern.
I've received a question from Brad that can probably go to either one of you to answer, or even both of you. So Brad has asked, he says he's become interested in carbon sequestration. What can individuals do to promote practices that will help to take carbon out of the air?
Would you like me to go ahead first?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, first of all, what we would like to promote is the organic and natural ways of capturing carbon from the air. Because one of the things that we are very, very concerned about is this very intensive effort now to promote what we call geoengineering methods for carbon sequestration. There's been discussions in Paris, for instance, about new technologies that are being developed for carbon sequestration, like the bioenergy carbon capture and sink. And we are very concerned about this because these technologies will also represent other dangers and risks, and might be used as an excuse for governments or corporations to not work as hard to make sure that there is actual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So for natural systems for carbon sequestration, of course, there are the forests, so we need to protect our forests even more. And there should be efforts for reforestation in the right way, because there has been disastrous initiatives in the past where the wrong kind of trees have been planted in the Philippines, for instance, which have had bad impacts on our watersheds and groundwater. And these are the kind of natural carbon capture approaches that we have been promoting and emphasizing as the right way to go.
So I have to agree with everything that we just heard, but I would also want to really emphasize that one of the reasons that we like to think about the possibility of sequestering carbon is that we are less comfortable with the idea of changing lifestyle that would reduce carbon in the atmosphere. So I guess what I would pose back is a challenge to consider that what we really need to be doing is altering lifestyle. It's clear that we need to be, reforestation would be at the top of my list of what we can do, and almost to say it's the most impactful and most necessary. But with that, also, we need to stop deforestation, and we need to be reconsidering the way that we live so that we're not increasing carbon. I mean, and I know that that's the less popular stand, but keeping fossil fuel in the ground is in fact what will shift this for us.
So, Peggy, I want to ask you the same question that I asked Liddy around your organizing work around this issue here in the U.S. Can you tell us a little bit about what that organizing looks like and what options there might be to plug in some of our partners who might be on the call now?
So a lot of the work that's being done around food justice and climate is about encouraging hyper-local solutions, because there are no laws currently that are really holding corporations accountable in a way that is effective. So really, it's about how each person is living and where our own food is. I find the most effective thing to do for a group, to motivate a group, is to track any food that they normally eat. So I like to start with bananas and ask the questions about where the banana came from, who's on that land, who are those workers. For bananas, there's some serious chemicals that are used to stop ripening, and cancer rates for the women who do that work. So if you follow a food right from the beginning and you follow it onto a truck and through neighborhoods and the way that people are breathing and the asthma rates of those neighborhoods onto your plate. So bananas are ubiquitous in the United States and incredibly cheap. But the cost of that is so high. So what I find for organizing is to follow any food and help people to understand the real impact of the food, and then to shift to what is it that grows right here, what grows well here, and how can we as a community organize around our own food security, how can we empower ourselves and each other. So nationally what's happening is a lot of empowering local communities. So the community garden, the urban garden movement that was started in Chicago in 1989 has really become a national movement, and while it's national, it's simultaneously local, but it challenges the system. It says that we don't need corporations to provide our food. We are capable of providing our own food. And there's a reskilling to that too. In New York here, we can't eat food, we can't grow food 12 months a year, although we can grow food far more months a year than I think most people assume that we can, but in April in particular, that's our lowest production month. But if we have frozen food, if we've preserved food and dried food, we are able to sustain ourselves as people did on this land for centuries. We don't require corporations, and by being more local, we can be more aware of the systems and have more control over the system. So nationally, that's what's happening. And the organizing has a lot to do with telling the stories and empowering people to work with their neighbors to restructure the systems that they're dependent on.
Thank you. I think some questions have come in. Eileen, can you share those with us? Yeah, I can hear you now. Great,
Okay.
thank you.
So we have, for Liddy, we have a question from Valerie. We've been hearing a lot in recent years about climate smart agriculture, which is being promoted in developing countries as a viable solution to the climate crisis. We'd like to know if you can maybe explain briefly to the audience what climate smart agriculture is and whether or not you and people that you work with believe it's a viable solution to climate crisis.
Sorry, I was just struggling with the mute button. Yes, climate smart agriculture is a label that has been used for a package of policies that some are not so bad and actually on their own can be quite helpful. But the reason why there's a lot of concern among farmers groups and even others, civil society groups and movements like ours about this whole package of climate smart agriculture is that, well, first, it is being promoted by the UN and other agencies like the World Bank together with what they call their major partners for this, which is the big multinational corporations. I was in fact in the Climate Summit in 2014 in New York for this particular session because I gave a presentation on agriculture and food and climate change, and you know it was a smaller forum, a smaller session, and the key people in the room were the president of McDonald's and many presidents and CEOs of big multinational companies that have to do with food and food production. And this is really very alarming for small food producers and farmers movements because it means that climate smart agriculture is not addressing major issues that have to do with who controls food production, what kind of food is being produced, and the fact that these big multinational corporations are threats to the livelihoods of small food producers, especially in many southern countries. Another key concern that we have about the climate smart agriculture, it is not critical towards technologies such as GMOs in food production, as well as it implies that there will also be an effort to explore developing new technologies for carbon capture and seizure, particularly in the with the use of land in this kind of technologies. So the term climate smart may sound good, and they may be promoting some of the elements of this package that, as I said, on a standalone basis or a separate, may not look so bad, but will actually look good. But if you take it as a package, then that is something that many of us in the South cannot accept. There are efforts by some groups to redefine what is climate smart, but unfortunately that label has already been promoted a lot in association with this package of policies and programs that has been, as I mentioned to you, has a lot of concerns for us.
Okay. I want to take this time to remind folks that are online, if you would like to ask a question, you need to type a question into the question box that's within your control panel on the right. I've been seeing some hands that are raised, and we have challenges unmuting people to speak during the webinar. So if you could type a question, we'll do our best to share the question. I have a question from Brad and also one from Terrence that I'm going to kind of combine together. It's kind of a two-part thing that I think they go together. So Brad's question is, he says, I agree with Peggy's comment about lifestyle, but if there is already too much carbon in the air, what can we do at a grassroots level to reduce what's already in the atmosphere? So that's the first part. But then we also have Terrence who's asking, when you have industrialists that are polluting heavily, how do we make sure that they're held accountable and engaged to make reductions as well? So on the one hand, there's what can we do at the grassroots level to reduce what's already in the atmosphere, and then how do we hold industrial operations accountable and have solutions on that end?
So I think that I'm going to agree with you that these are two parts of the same question. I think that the ways that we hold corporations accountable will be done on the grassroots level. So what has happened now, for instance, there are corporations that are burning waste and putting that in the atmosphere, and there have been there are many laws about that, but most corporations are not held accountable to those laws unless people make a big deal out of it, and that's what's been happening. So I think of a group in Detroit right now and another group in New Jersey right now that have organized, so completely grassroots movement, people who live in the neighborhood, largely parents who don't want their children breathing what's being pumped into their air, who have organized and have created campaigns to reduce, and really what they're doing is they're creating campaigns to require local companies to stick with the laws as they are. In a lot of cases, it's not even about requiring the law to change. It's really about enforcing, which isn't done, and it's done as it's ignored as practice. There are fines associated with ignoring it, and the fines are usually lower than it would cost to actually, do the work that needs to be done to reduce. So they they go with the fines unless enough people gather together. So one of the things we can do is organize in our own neighborhoods around reduction of what's being pumped into the air. And I will say that one of the things that I have done in neighborhoods is I've asked people to just walk with me. Often people will say that their air is fine or there's nothing they can do or they don't know what's really happening. So you start walking neighborhoods and paying attention and asking questions. What is this building? Who works in this building? What do they do in this building? Where does their waste go? So just asking a tremendous amount of questions, and that has changed things. We started to do it in Southwest Yonkers not long ago, and just discovered so many things that local people didn't know about what was happening in their own neighborhoods. So that's one thing we can do. And I'm not remembering the other part of this question. It was about grassroots. What can we do at the grassroots level to sequester carbon or to reduce carbon in the atmosphere? Is that right?
I believe the other part was about how do we address industrial carbon production? Right. Was that?
Yeah. Yes.
So the other thing that's happening right now is that with the United States signing the Paris Agreement, which just happened last week, we now have a document that as a nation we've said we want to uphold, and I think that it provides us power to create new laws to hold corporations accountable. And there are a lot of organizations, I'm going to be honest, there's a lot of organizations that are working against the Paris Agreement, even climate organizations, because they don't think it goes far enough. Frankly, to be working against ourselves doesn't make any sense to me. At the very least, what we should be doing is connecting with the organizations that are right now mobilizing people to create new moral norms for Congress and to hold our own nation accountable to the promises we have now made, the way that the Paris Agreement is laid out. Every nation declares for themselves what their intentions are around how they're going to reach the goals, which is a really wonderfully empowering piece of this, and it is also the way that nations like the United States were able to get the Paris Agreement to go through, because we don't need Congress to sign off on it. So with that, though, we do need Congress to pay attention to what the goals are and to start creating policy. So one of the things that we can be doing is now joining with other people around the nation who are mobilizing to create a shared voice being raised in support, and that will change the policy, that will help corporations to do what they need to do on their part. The other thing I want to say, since this is PCUSA, that as denominations, we have the faith voice in this is critical. I mean, absolutely critical. I went to a meeting with the State Department in November, and the primary takeaway from that, and this is from the State Department, was to say that the voice of faith leaders is incredibly powerful, that this is about business, government, and faith. And if we can have those three voices, and while plenty of businesses and corporations aren't going to abide, there are a lot that will. And that government, our current administration, wants to be able to push this and needs a mandate for it. And the faith community creates the mandate. So that when we are really holding our visions, when we're doing the pushing, our State Department has said they want to do the listening. They've also said, as a reminder, whatever it is that they get through, they're going to cheer and say, isn't that great? And they require the faith community to say, that was great, but it wasn't great enough, and here's what else has to happen. And the State Department was really asking the faith community to do that, saying we can't push these things through if we don't have you being, bold and loud and clear about what's needed. So I think that our faith leaders, our denominations, have a critical role in all of this.
We have another question for Liddy. You talked in the very beginning of your presentation about how recent events in the Philippines where some farmers had been killed around when they were demonstrating around not having food during times of drought. How is the government responding? What's been the international reaction and response to the incident?
Well, in the beginning, the government response at the national level was really very disappointing, even deplorable. The president didn't say anything for like almost 2 days, and there were a lot of efforts from the national government to try to obfuscate or, confuse people about the issue, saying that, because there were infiltrators in there, that's why the police shot at them, and so on and so forth. But the videos of what happened were very clear, that the shooting was really unprovoked because the farmers were just holding their grounds there. And then afterwards, the local police, after open fire, also arrested more than 100 people, including many grandmothers who were actually detained for more than 2 weeks until, for them so that they could be released. The local governor was even worse because she, there was a lot of pouring of support. People were sending sacks of rice and so on, but she ordered the police she prevented the farmers from accessing the support using the police. So the police surrounded the farmers. They took refuge in a Methodist church compound, and they prevented the farmers from accessing the rice. But there has been a lot of public outcry, so that the latest, for instance, is the governor has been arrested and is going to appear before the ombudsman to explain her behavior and her actions and her policies. So I guess this is now the national government trying their best to remedy this very awkward and very deplorable situation they themselves when the first reaction was to be defensive. And there's also been, all the public outcry also triggered better responses from government in terms of responding to the emergency situation of drought and hunger. But this situation will get worse in the next 4 months, because the worst part of El Nino will be in the next 4 months, starting now in April, and we're going into May now. And the government did not prepare well for it, even though the projection for El Nino and its impacts were already released since a year and a half ago. So the government didn't take heed the reports of its very own agency that does these reports and these projections, and they're not prepared, even though there are funds that they could have used for this. So it's still an effort on our part to engage the government to make sure that there is adequate response to what is already a real emergency. We have asked the government to declare a state of calamity in more than 38 provinces, which the Pag-asa, which is the government agency that does these studies and projections, have already said a couple of months ago will surely be very seriously affected in the next 4 months.
Liddy, we have another question for you. Has to do with seeds. So the question is, what role do seeds play in efforts to address climate change?
Well, one of the important issues to food security is a control of seeds by our local producers, and especially the type of the seeds of traditional types of rice, for instance, which is a staple in the Philippines. Through a long history of wrong government policies and corporate meddling and capture of seeds, for instance, and domination by corporate interests through the promotion of fertilizers, artificial fertilizers, very expensive fertilizers and pesticides because they're mostly imported. Farmers have lost further their control over our food production systems. So given the situation, which was not caused by climate change initially, the impact of climate change, the fact that our farmers are very vulnerable increases the impacts of climate change on their situation. So in order to ensure in the face of climate change impacts our food security, we must reverse the situation and work for reclaiming of control by farmers, by our local food producers, over seeds, over their right to determine how they're going to produce, to assert more sustainable food production, and for us as a people to also reclaim the traditional varieties which are more sustainable, that we are already losing fast because of what has happened to our food production systems in the last 30 years.
Liddy, thank you for sharing that, and thanks to both Liddy and Peggy for joining us this afternoon. We're coming up on the close of our hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I know that there are other questions out there that are waiting. And so what I'd like to do is to move those questions over to our Google group. And if each of you would feel free to send your questions into the Google group, then we can follow up with responses to the questions along with the PowerPoint and other resources from today's call via the Google chat room. Once again, thank you so much to Liddy and Peggy for joining us. Our next call, let's see, our next meeting is Wednesday, June 8th at 2. And our topic for that call is access to land. And Liddy touched on that a little bit, the importance of having access to land for the production of food staples. So we will be having that as our next topic. All of our topics are really building on one another. Last time we talked about seeds, and Liddy was just telling us about the role of seeds in helping to address the climate change issue. And next we'll move into access to land. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And we will see you again Wednesday, June 8th. Thank you so much, Liddy. Thank you so much, Peggy. Take care, everyone.